again, I extend my heartfelt thanks and gratitude to everybody who's taken time out on a Sunday to join us. So, the topic for our conversation with Shrayana today is navigating global trends, youth labor force participation, and gender intersection. So, over the period of the last 5 days, what we've realized with talking to everybody over here in the gender equality theme is that through gender, the SDG 5, which is the gender equality goal, that sort of plays into all the other goals as well. Gender plays a huge role in the other SDGs. So there is a heavy intersection of gender in sort of everything that we do. Although in theory, the rights and opportunities for all genders are equal, but does that really translate into reality? So to sort of understand this question, we'll be chatting with Shrayana. And allow me to introduce Shrayana a little bit. So there's a lot to say about Shrayana, but I've just taken down some points. So Shrayana is an economist in the World Bank's Social Protection and Labor Unit for South Asia. Prior to joining the World Bank, she has worked with Institute of Social Studies Trust, with whom we have had several sessions in the Changemaker20 Summit. The International Labour Organization, SEWA, and Center for Policy Research on a range of issues in the areas of urban bureaucracy, social protection, and informality. Shrayana is also the author of the book Desperately Seeking Shahrukh, which also has a Hindi version called Mahilanomics, Umeed, Unnati, and Shahrukh Khan. And she's also the recipient of Times of India's Author Prize and AGBLF Prize for Best Non-Fiction in 2022. Thank you so much, Shrayana, for being here. So I would sort of like to start our conversation with, if you could just give a remark on the statement that I've made, that is the theory that all genders have equal opportunities and rights, does that really translate into reality?
Well, firstly, Alicia, let me just thank you and congratulate the summit and everyone involved. It was really actually a pleasure right now to hear that the Institute of Social Studies Trust has also been involved, because one of the themes that actually I'll talk about a little bit is how much access to your first job as a young person. And, to clarify, I'm going to rely a lot on the institution I work with, the World Bank. A lot of our reports and analyses on what's happening to jobs and young people. So I want to credit the whole team that's been working all of this within the institution. Although at present I'm going to be speaking personally, not from the perspective of an institution, but I will draw on a lot of what my colleagues have been doing. And the first thing I want to clarify is, sort of for us, youth is 15 to 29. I think that's something that I know in nomenclature, it's important to just constantly clarify that. And it was lovely to hear about ISST, because they were my first employer. And one of the most important things we realized from all the evidence on youth and jobs is your first employer tends to have a very long lasting impact on your future career trajectory. So that's empirically true. So for me, it's really nice to actually be here. I think to reflect on what you just said, if you look at the global scenario right now, we recognize that there's increasingly this tension of young people with huge aspirations entering the labor market. And employers, on the other hand, so for example, at the World Bank, I have colleagues who do these surveys with employers in different countries, trying to understand why is it that you're not able to recruit people? Are you able to recruit people? And skills and information seems to be a constant issue that employers flag. They say that young people don't have the adequate skills, the technical skills, and so on. And what's fascinating to me is one of the things we keep hearing about in these surveys is what they call emotional resilience, right? The sort of agility and adaptability of young people to deal with very fluid circumstances. We're living now in a world of constant change. Change seems to be the eternal, right? And in that world, one of the things you keep hearing about is, well, women should be doing better in these particular circumstances, because, studies seem to suggest that resilience, adaptability, what I think some economists have often called sort of I hate that word, the nimble fingers argument, because that's usually used to sort of suggest that women should always be in low paying jobs, which use these nimble fingers to make garments at abominably low wage rates. But I think the larger challenge tends to be that women should be doing better because of their ability to respond to constant fluidity and their ability to have, I think, a more deliberative style of working, because of the way women are socialized across the world, right, in consultation. And yet, when you hear that enthusiasm, if you look at the data right now, you still see these very, very large gaps. So it could be countries like India, it could be countries in sub Saharan Africa, it could be countries in Latin America. The fact that you still see these huge gaps, and for those who want to get into the nitty gritties of the data, the World Bank publishes this on its public website, on our data portals. I'd encourage people to go look it up. There are youth employment rates and activity rates reported. And one of the things you notice is that actually across time, those particular gaps between young men and young women still seem to be fairly strong, particularly in some of the larger countries. So India is a great example. Many economists have written at length about the fact that most young women actually, forget surveys. You just step out of the home and ask any young woman. Everyone will say in India and particularly in South Asia, everybody wants to work. People want to have an independent identity. They want their own access to independent income. It's sort of seen as a very important part of your selfhood. And yet, if you look at the jobs that are being created by these economies, they seem to be, I mean, right now, the labor market, for example, in India tends to be around 80% male. It's fairly masculine, right? So while on paper opportunities exist for everyone, I think because of the structural barriers that many young women, and this is obviously exacerbated by community, different kinds of social cleavages, urban, rural, where you are based as well, that seems to really amplify this constant gap. But having said that, Alicia, one thing I do want to sort of highlight is I think the bank puts it at around 1.8 billion young people, and out of that, 85% are in developing or emerging economies. And what's very worrying is that around 1 out of 4 of these young people will only have jobs that offer them wages at the extreme poverty line of around $1.25 a day, which is the way we estimate it. And most of these jobs are informal, low pay. So I think we have a general crisis of young people in the labor market. I think that's a broad crisis that affects both men, women across the globe, particularly in developing economies, which is worrying given that these are actually the economies that are going to generate the energy and the future growth of the next decades. And within this, then there is a gender and a social cleavage problem, which is that within these groups, then when you start to slice the data, you basically find women are twice as likely to have inactivity rates, twice as likely to now be reported as being underemployed, twice as likely to be in low paid jobs. So I think what you're saying is true, but I think it's also within the overall context of this 1 out of 4 young person, right, who's not able to access a job which pays them a dignified living wage. And I think that's a real crisis. And I think the question that policymakers across the world actually will be asking themselves, and this is true as much for developed countries as developing countries, and I'm sure you've been discussing this during the summit, is what are more scalable solutions to at least check and offer some of the solutions that we can help youth connect to jobs better. And then within that, I think women need an additional fillip. Because you're seeing in the data and just in our general lives as well, there is a huge gap, especially when it comes to young people. And I think I'll close on the fact that what makes this, I think, most alarming is that what's really changed, I think, with media, the boom in different developing economies. India is not just the only one. This is true for a Kenya, a Nigeria as well, many other countries, even a Bangladesh, our neighbors. I think one of the things you realize is that because of this change in markets, media access, the internet, aspirations have really zoomed. It doesn't matter if you're a young boy or young girl living in rural Bangladesh or a very posh town in Delhi. What you're aspiring to has grown and has changed. And unfortunately, the labor market, though, is yet to adjust. And I think that's going to be this mismatch of expectations, perhaps, of what you aspire for and what the job market can offer you. I think that's really going to be a very important social problem, not just an economic problem for the future.
Absolutely. So, one of the things that you said, aspirations have definitely zoomed in. And but yeah, there's a big mismatch of demand and supply over here.
Yeah.
Like I want to do something, but do I really have that opportunity in the market? So my next question to you would be that why does this gap
Yeah.
generally increase? I mean, for a layperson like me, I would just cite a very basic example, is that I was working with an organization where we used to help youth from slum communities get placement
Yeah.
opportunities. And what we saw over there is that over the period of 5 years, the sort of eligibility criteria for certain jobs has also changed. For example, if I would want to be a barista at a popular chain, then 5 years back, the educational criteria required was probably of a 10th pass candidate. And now it's over the period of 5 to 10 years, it's now increased to a graduate level. So, why does this happen, and why does there's obviously a divide in getting skilled as well. So, yeah, just your comments on this fact.
So, I think one of the things to note, actually, just, going back to that global number, because I want to sort of, instill the discipline in us and not just talking about India and South Asia, given where we're located, but I want to sort of zoom out a little bit. One of the things we realize, if you look at the data, is, 1 out of 3 young people are not in education, training, or employment, right? So, what we call the NEET numbers. Now, that's very worrying. And what's even more worrying is post COVID. So, in 2018, prior to the pandemic, about 58% of young people were what we call inactive. And inactive, for those who don't understand that parlance, means you're not in the labor market, nor are you looking for a job, right? And you, in a way, what we tend to think of inactivity as someone who's essentially lost faith that they will find a job, so there's no point, right? Or you're just waiting for the best opportunity and you're not looking at the current moment, right? Like, so in India, that the best example of that is people who are just perpetually trying to take exams, but in a way they're still at least holding their hand up and saying, I'm interested in finding a job in the labor market. But 58% were inactive. Now, following COVID, I think the last time the number was estimated at a global level, it was on 2020, and it's 61.4% of young people who are inactive. And that inactivity rate is much higher for women. But it's also very much shared by boys, young boys as well. And I think what's happening is two things. And I think this links to the question that you asked me, which is why are we seeing this gap between what young people want and expect from a job and what the employers are expecting? I think the first thing is, I actually think the linkages between the demand side and the supply side, right, just are not yet operating at scale. And I'll give you a simple example. When we typically think of youth employment programs now across the globe, I think it's changing. It's changed significantly in the past 4 or 5 years. Largely, it tends to be, well, let's just get them trained, right? So there's this idea that youth employment is only going to happen through skills training, and that's a very important component. And there are very critical reforms that have happened not just in India but in many other countries about better accreditation, involving the private sector when it comes to designing these skill programs. But one of the bigger challenges seems to be that if you only focus on sort of the degree giving part or the training aspects of it, I think what you tend to lose out is perhaps a more agile system where your curriculum constantly develops. And also, the most important thing, and I think this, I'll just go back again to the ISST metaphor, you learn by doing, right? And the amount of learning through doing and through actually being exposed, either through apprenticeships or through internships or through just jobs, is unparalleled to what you will learn anywhere in the classroom. One great example of this is in Rwanda. My colleagues at the bank have a project which is focused on young people and getting them better trained. And one of the things they're doing, Alicia, is instead of the typical classroom-based training, they call it more student-centered pedagogy. So what they tend to do is they give you a concept and then they break you up into groups and then they say, you figure it out. And it creates confusion initially, but if you start to look at the results, and again, all of this is published, we have a solutions for youth employment portal that's managed by colleagues at the bank. People are welcome to go look at it. One of the things we basically realize is that this has huge impact. So I think the first challenge is actually, it's not good enough to just say skills, right? That there's a skills mismatch. But I think the point is, do young people, are they even trained in a way that will teach them the skills that purportedly you're teaching them on paper. I mean, I can very honestly say to you, I was apparently trained in economics, but I think I learned a lot of my economics when I was sent out to the field, right? And I think this is true for many of us. And still, of course, you need a very strong foundation, but I think there is a lot more that we can do when it comes to just serving our youth better by redesigning or rethinking some of the way the curriculum is packaged, organized, delivered, right? So making it much more student centered and youth centered, as opposed to just saying, well, this is just the curriculum and we'll just push it out. I think that model that needs to change. So I think that's one big issue. I think the second big issue in this mismatch is information, right? I think many young people, while I do think we're no longer in the world of young people looking at the world and saying, well, I can only be a doctor and an engineer, or in rural areas, young men saying, I can only be in agriculture. You're seeing, looking at the data, in fact, a lot of young men don't want to be in agriculture or what are considered traditional occupations, right? And I think what is happening is that there's an interest in exploring different careers. So, for example, people might be interested in the creative economy, people might be interested in their own business, right? Or different types of sectors. But the information available to them about exactly what you just said, for example, which is that what is the basic criteria that's required for you to get a job as a barista somewhere, or the fact that that's changed. How do you get access to the hiring and recruitment networks, right? That information gap, there still seems to be a huge asymmetry, and I think that creates actually a lot of deep inequality amongst youth, because unsurprisingly, young people who are much better connected through English, for instance, or through the internet to the world outside will always have a much higher structural advantage, right? So you see these gaps just replicating themselves. And I think one of the things, for example, we have projects in Bangladesh and in Nepal, which seem to suggest that when you start to give information to young people, not just training, but counseling and information, it's sort of a plus component that really seems to have a very important impact in whether young people feel confident enough that they can go ahead and seek these opportunities, right? So that's the second. So the first is the skills ecosystem. I think the second is information and counseling. And the third, I think, it's creating this fundamental mismatches with just, I mean, I think, I'm sure you've discussed it before, which is that I think in the way sectors are evolving, are we really keeping young people in mind when it comes to the design and reform of some of these sectors? I wonder sometimes. I think I always joke that often so much of economic policy is just made by a bunch of like elderly men, um, which really harms women, because I think so many of us are constantly not even on the table, right, with so many issues about our labor codes, our wages, valuing childcare, for instance. I think the same issue actually holds for young people. I think, where are the spaces? And I think that's why this summit is such a welcome initiative. And, youth summits, I think, across the world are very welcome initiative, because where are the spaces for young people to make their economic demands heard, felt in a more institutional way, not just, relying on the political cycle, but where are the spaces for young people to voice what they think, for example, should be happening to sectoral reform, or what are their issues when it comes to accessing jobs? I think often when you think about who's making those decisions, right? And I think that's also why people feel so disenfranchised from the process, because they're not part of it. They don't see anyone who's like them being part of it as well, right? And I think that's a huge gap. We don't talk about it enough. We tend to only talk about the more technical issues, but I think this voice gap of young people in policy making. I don't know why. I mean, of course, policy making requires experience, technical skills. All of that is valid and absolutely true. But surely you also want to be consulting the groups that are actually going to be most affected and are going to determine the trajectory of your economy, right? And if you look at who's making decisions, it's essentially people definitely above the age of 29 for sure. But even institutional places for people to come and make submissions as young groups, interested, say, in the diamond industry or in the garments industry, you don't see that much across the world. I think there are a few examples, and I think that's going to grow. So to me, I think those three are really important. I mean, one is, I think, the skills mismatch, which is, you may aspire to have a certain job, but you have the skills, and are the private sector and the government at scale collaborating to provide those skills to you in a useful and pedagogically centered way. The second is information and counseling for sure, and the third is the whole conversation about where will the jobs come from, but not just leaving that to older people, but involving actually stakeholders who are impacted by those decisions. I think, to me, those three things will be very important moving forward.
Absolutely. Um, I was actually about to ask you a question, but I think you've answered that about the information bit. That there is, of course, you mentioned the access to sort of understanding and learning English language, the access to digital spaces. So there is a huge divide in that. So there is a digital divide. There's a language barrier. There are a lot of things um, which affect this whole aspirations plus the skills if they have, and then again if there is enough supply or demand of that same aspiration or skill in the market. So how would you sort of, then again, if we have to, this is more of a general statement that I think we've understood, but how would we look at it through a gendered lens? How is this affecting different sections of different genders differently? I mean, they're obviously, because again, like you said, if we just sort of step out and just take a look around, we see that there is a huge difference that we see. There are different kinds of people doing different things. There are different kinds of people wanting to access something and then not getting access to something or the other. Then how would you look at these three things that you have mentioned from a gendered lens?
So I think, Alicia, the first thing to remember is the experience of how gender or different identities will intersect, right, with your experience of being a young person entering the labor market is obviously going to be very different based on sort of the societies that you're operating in and the rules of the game, right, in those societies. I think, for example, one of the things we know is that for a young woman, even, just I'll take the example of India, one of the biggest shifts is, for a young woman growing up, even in the south of the country, or say the northeast or the eastern regions of the country, you experience perhaps public space to start with very differently. And one of the biggest issues I think that young people face, and I think these are just compounded particularly for women, is that if public space, which is actually what you need to access markets, right? If you want to go, for example, all the things that we just talked about, you want to go get trained, you need transport, you need safe housing, maybe if you want to get trained in a better place, which is further away from the city or from where you live. If you need, for example, learning material, often parents will say, well, we'll support a woman's marriage and maybe not her learning material, right? So you hear that, and it holds in many cultures actually across, not just, I think India is not just one example of it. India is perhaps, in some parts of India, it's an extreme example of it, but this happens in many parts of the world. And the third is, for example, if you want to get information, counseling, apprenticeships, all of this requires movement in the public world. And one thing we know is that it's not that young people don't want, especially young women, don't want to take the risk or the chance, even if there is a threat of lack of safety or feeling, uncomfortable for different reasons in the way public space is organized. I know so many young women, and I've written about them in my book, who are willing to take that chance in India, certainly. And I think this is true for women around the world. But I think the real question then becomes, in the way all these spaces are architected, be it our skills ecosystem, be it how, counseling and one-stop shops, for example, are going to organize. If you want jobs portals, the data seems to suggest that while having online jobs portals is helpful, yes, but a physical interface is always very impactful when it comes to particularly guidance, questions, tailored advice, right, which is very, very critical to young people. This is the reason why, for example, very elite children end up doing extremely well, only because they're always able to access these very tailored services designed for them, which is really not something that many young people are able to access. And I think there are government programs that are trying to respond to that. But the issue is, in the way these systems are architected, are you thinking very carefully about making these spaces more friendly for women, more friendly? And I don't, friendly often, it isn't just about safety, it's not about having a bunch of, for example, police people outside, because I think that actually can frighten people even more. I think it's a question of how many women are in the room. Maybe in some cases you want all women counseling spaces so that some women feel more comfortable. right? Showing up and standing in line. I think each one of us has had probably some very scary experiences just queuing up for a basic certificate or anything in public space, for example, in a city like Delhi. I can say I have, and I think this is true for many of my friends. Now, in that world, would it perhaps be helpful to have just all female spaces in some places, right? So I think the question really becomes, when you know in some countries and in some contexts, um, access to public space and feeling comfortable in public space is going to be so compromised. Perhaps thinking a little bit more carefully about the way those spaces are designed, and designed as in, where they're located, who's present in them, who's managing them, what are sort of their capacity sets as well. Sensitizing, I think, recently there's been this handbook that's been doing the rounds in India right now, for example, about gender stereotypes and language. I think being a bit more cautious and preemptive, right, in the way we socialize people managing some of these spaces, so that it actually works for everyone involved. So that's, I think that's one very important critical aspect. Now, the other, which, I mean, and this is where, as I said, these are personal views, but I'm a really big believer in, is that in some contexts where the gender barriers are just so large to surmount, nothing short of a very radical step will perhaps do. And, for example, thinking a bit more carefully about affirmative action in maybe some science and technology sectors, right? And I think that's going to be really critical moving forward, simply because if you can't affirm and at least allow some of those spaces, one of the things we know from all the data is role models and peer effects are very important, in unshackling particularly women and young women's access. Because if they see one young woman in their village or in their town who's going and accessing a certain opportunity, suddenly there is a kind of group mobilization that can occur. And group mobilization is very critical. Now, given that, perhaps thinking a little bit about sunrise sunset clauses, right, about giving young women more priority, particularly those from disadvantaged communities, more priority perhaps in certain queues, be it for jobs, be it access to certain government programs. I think that might be a very useful way, at least to think about designing and handling some of these spaces. I think the last thing I'll say about this, and I think this is important, is men will have to play a role, right? Young men will have to play a role, because, we keep saying, I mean, there's a gender gap, or there are women feeling unsure. I think so much of what I think holds them back is also they don't feel adequately supported or championed, perhaps, by men in their own families or young men around them. And I think, given that, it's going to be really critical to have men get involved in this process as well. So I think, to me, all the gaps that we just talked about are just much more exaggerated for women, and they're exacerbated particularly in contexts where access to mobility and just freedom of movement for women is going to be compromised. And I think that's what you really need to be very careful about. And the last thing I will say, I mean, I think this is something, I'm sure there are other panels that have discussed this at length, is that, we have this problem of ghettoizing women's jobs. So women will always, be in beauty parlors and salons and sort of certain types of jobs, which, by the way, that's great. I think that, those jobs are really tough jobs. And I wish some of those jobs were just better paid and better regulated for more women. So, I'm thinking about jobs in the care economy and so on. But I think perhaps in the way, and this you're seeing in government programming across the world. I mean, from sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle East to North Africa to South Asia, you are seeing government programs that are extremely interested in essentially arguing for more women to be present in non-traditional sectors. And I think that's going to be really critical.
Absolutely. Um, uh, okay. Now, my next question was about the challenges that women face, but then I think we've discussed that, and especially, like you said, if somebody I mean, if one woman tries to move out of the space and sort of tries to trace her own path, then there'll be a group mobilization that you spoke about. Similarly, what I have seen, at least from personal experiences, then if one woman sort of faces an issue, a challenge, then that sort of challenge sort of you know stops a lot of women from, I mean, their families, communities, etc. would also again stop a major a section of women to go ahead and do something. I mean, works both ways. I think that if somebody moves out, then there will be people who will be moving out with her. But if there's some problem faced by a woman, then I think that also would stop communities or families to sort of let them move and go and do whatever they feel like doing. Now, Shana, we have discussed a lot about employment part. Now, if you could just shed some light about the emerging patterns of youth in entrepreneurship. I think we are hearing entrepreneurial the entrepreneurship a lot. I think people now want to do a lot of businesses of their own. They have a lot of aspirations of apna business karna hai, and then going and tracing those paths. But again, that sort of access to set up a business would also be different for different groups. And how do you see youth in the entrepreneurial sector of not only just India? If you have insights from across the globe, then yes, please do share.
Yeah, so
I did
Alicia,
articulate it well, but
yeah, no, so Alicia, one of the things that we now know is, I think, so for example, I think it's important to take a very sectoral lens, right? So it's not good enough to just say, well, we're going to train people and give them counseling. But I think increasingly we are living in a world where the economy is very fluid in terms of where jobs are being created, the types of jobs. Technology is really upending the types of jobs and the types of roles that people can have. And you really need a labor force that is prepared for a lot of that change. So, for example, it could be, what we call the circular economy, the gig economy, the blue economy, agriculture. So much is changing, and young people have to be trained to essentially be ready to face a lot of that change in the labor market, be it through their digital skills, be it through their access to certain types of technical skills, and also, as we talked about, right, the ability to essentially anticipate and respond to some of these constant changes. Now, given that, I think entrepreneurship is actually one of the key areas. Now, what tends to happen, of course, and I think this is where we should, sort of, it's a line of caution, which is, often what we think of as entrepreneurship also can just be really low paid, insecure forms of self employment. And I think you're seeing this across the world, particularly for women, which is that often they're running sort of, these very small businesses. And, often some do very well and they end up being sort of featured in documentaries and magazine covers. But there's a large story of street vendors, for example, who are really insecure when it comes to their access to public space. This is not just true for India, this is true for several other countries in the global south. And I think one of the key challenges when it comes to entrepreneurship is not just the skills and the question around training people so that they're ready to manage their own businesses, but I think is actually a very clear conversation about access to finance. Many people, especially young people who actually have perhaps more entrepreneurial energy and zeal, don't actually have the collateral or access to land or access to capital markets or access to land markets to be able to make claims or essentially build funds for their own business, right, to grow their own businesses. And I think there's a vicious cycle which I think many economists and others talk about, which is when young people anyway are at risk of having these low, sort of lesser access to certain core financial markets or access to finance and access to assets. And yet many companies or many sort of, organizations that would perhaps provide funding require that they have some experience and access to assets. So it's a sort of vicious trap, right? And it's a sort of low productivity trap that many young people who are interested in exploring and growing their businesses end up almost being stuck in. And there are only two or three ways, I think, and there are global examples of these kinds of experiences. JPAL, for example, has done a rigorous evaluation of various, methods to try and sort of unshackle people from this low productivity trap. And essentially what we find is it's not just access to assets, but it's this combination that we talked about. So it's access to assets, but also broader access to information and counseling. I think people need to believe that they can run their businesses and they can rely on each other. And the third and most important is going to be peer effects, right? So groups that come together and help each other out, at least managing risk as well as managing and providing advice and guidance to each other. So perhaps youth group managed businesses and so on. Now, given that, I think one, of course, as we talked about, is access to assets. But the other part of this story is also the fact that I think young people, we will do a huge disservice to young people who want to grow their businesses or want to run, get into roles of, micro entrepreneurship in particular, because many of these businesses will not be large businesses. They'll be small micro enterprises. I think we'll be doing a huge disservice to them if we also don't create an effective safety net for these businesses. And what I mean by that is, if we want young people to take risks, if we want young people to display this kind of entrepreneurial zeal, at some level, we also have to provide some economic assurance that if things really go bust, they can rely on at least some core government programs or core kinds of support. And what I mean, for example, I'm not talking about a bailout. I mean, that's actually the worst economic outcome. What I'm talking about is perhaps life insurance, accident insurance, or perhaps a universal basic income, some core social assistance programs that people at least feel that they are psychologically assured that they have some support, even if things don't really go well. Because if you don't have that support, then expecting young people to go ahead and be risk taking, to essentially display and follow their entrepreneurial instincts, I think is quite unfair, actually, an expectation on a generation that's quite precarious anyway. So I think a couple of things need to be done. One is, as I said, some kind of universal social protection assistance. I think across the board is required to at least provide that assurance to people. I think the second is going to be really critical, which is looking at how better to access or connect young people to these factor markets, right? Be it finance, be it land, be it housing, be it different types of markets for not just collateral, but also to claim ownership and set up businesses. I think that's going to be really key. And the third is the more traditional. I think what I'm sure many have discussed during your seminars here is training skills, not just soft skills, hard skills, business management skills, providing that. A great example, in fact, I think many of the best examples of a lot of this actually do come from Bangladesh. There's a program right now that colleagues of mine are implementing there called RAISE, which essentially connects young youth, they are youth, essentially with focus on young women, who are essentially trying to build micro enterprises of their own. And through a package of services, and I think the word package is very important, not only are they provided some training, some support in terms of grants or perhaps matching grants, but they're also provided handholding support. And you're seeing actually many of these businesses are growing and are becoming much more stable. And I think that might be a very useful way to go. So I think not just thinking of it in terms of we just need to train people with what we call our entrepreneurial skills and business management skills, but taking a slightly broader view, which is if we really want people to take risks, we also need to provide some assurance. So that's really important, be it social security, insurance, and so on. And I think the second is think a little bit more carefully about how you connect young people to factor markets. I think that's going to be really key. Particularly financing, but even beyond financing, I think land and so on. How do you do that? I think that's going to be a very important challenge for the future to support entrepreneurship.
Absolutely. I think that also answers my questions of suggestions for what are the best practices that can be done, or what sort of interventions from the governments and policymakers can make things a little easier for the young people to scale this path. So my final segment of this chat would be uh, the the sorry, forgot my word. Okay, the gap that we see in the informal market and the formal markets of youth in labor force participation. How does that play in societies and economies? Like, what are the implications of this huge gap that we see in formal economies and informal economies? How does that play into the society and economy at large? The gap that we see. Yes.
So we know that, I mean, in most countries, being part of a formal job, and let's define formal job, I'll sort of use the ILO definition. It's essentially someone who has access to a core set of. I don't want to use typically people also define informality and formality based on the size of the organization you work for. I think more than that, it's whether you have access to some formal social security or not. And we know, for instance, most young people who are entering the job market, and by the way, this is true for very privileged young people in the gig economy, and extremely marginalized, precarious people entering these kinds of jobs as well. No one really has a clear social security net or a cover, right? And I think, given that world, I think one thing that you are buying when you sort of enter into the formal sector is you are entering into one of the most privileged parts of the economy. It's the hyper privileged part. I often say, in India, for example, having access to what we call a provident fund. I mean, these are all these social insurance mechanisms or long term aging retirement savings funds and so on. These are luxuries for most in the labor market. I mean, nearly 60 to 70% of the labor market does not have access to these. And while we do increasingly have, and this is not just true for India, this is true for many other developing countries, very exciting, interesting micro insurance products where people can contribute in a flexible way digitally. I think what's essentially happening is that there are still challenges in people being able to understand these programs and access them, right? Now, the reason I mention this is because I do believe that a large part of what tends to happen then when you are in the informal economy is that you're constantly in this state of deep precarity. And it's not just precarity of sort of the obvious material kind, but it's also a psychological precarity, right? And this links back to your question about, can young people actually sort of actuate their ambitions? Can they feel confident? You need to feel confident in the decisions you want to make, right? Now, if the economy is not instilling too much confidence in you, you're going to make the most traditional, perhaps sometimes fairly bad business decisions or bad decisions with your future choices because you just want to play it safe and really safe, perhaps sometimes, right? And in some cases, people don't even have the luxury of playing it safe, particularly when you look at the sort of, the bottom of the pyramid of our economy, where people are just essentially working different jobs to be able to survive. So I think, to me, the biggest challenge between this formal and informal story is actually what assurance as a society are we providing. This is true for old people, but also particularly young people who are at this stage can save for their future, right? What assurance are you providing them that the government will match their instincts, their energies, their efforts, right, towards the GDP with some kind of social protection support? And I think that's going to be really critical. And that gap, feeling that you're not really taken care of, right, grows. And there's a misunderstanding, I think, often because many countries across the world have these large, anti-poverty programs. Here in India, for example, we have the public distribution system. There are many universal entitlements, but they don't necessarily, in terms of the depth of the benefit, they don't necessarily, number one, it's not like all young people are using them, and not all young people have access to them necessarily. And the third thing, I think, is that it's, these may not be instruments designed for the needs of young people. Perhaps young people just need a sort of a stipend when they enter a skill program, which is linked to their productivity or whether they join jobs or not. This is happening, for example, in some Indian schemes, right now, Indian programs that are being run. Now, I think the real issue is, to me, between this formal and informal tension, is this feeling that there is a large group of us in the labor market who are not essentially being provided any assurance. And I think, given that the informal economy also has more precarious earnings, particularly those from sort of the micro entrepreneurship world, street vendors, people making home based garments, earning a quarter of minimum wage, even your domestic worker who's not really covered by a written codified contract, I think the more precarious these jobs become, and we know they don't pay as well, they don't have enough protections, right, for workers, you're just going to create more and more unrest, right? Because the inequalities are just going to grow and grow. And if you have a large group of young people entering the labor market feeling nervous, unsure, and not feeling like they're being accounted for or taken care of in some way with at least some minimal assurance, I think we're going to essentially, these divides between the formal and the informal are going to grow. I'm not someone, this is my personal belief, I'm not someone who believes you're going to be able to formalize everybody. I think there are going to be informal jobs given the nature of the way the global economy is working, and there are many economists, and I think there are World Bank reports and IMF reports on some of these ideas of, can we genuinely just formalize everyone? I don't think we're living in a world where everyone will have a formal job. But given that informality has been such an enduring attribute, certainly of developing economies and now increasingly of developed economies, surely the question now needs to be actually be about social protection for young people. And I think that's really, I mean, I know it's typically social protection is not usually what people talk about when they want to talk about youth and jobs, because I think we again just talk about skills and we just talk about sort of, sectoral reforms. But to me, what has to really underpin all of this has to be some core assurance provided to young people in the form of social security as they're entering the labor market. If we really want them to be better trained, take risks, follow their instincts, if we don't support them in those endeavors through at least a very clear basic social insurance net, I think we're going to be doing a disservice to a lot of young people who will then end up again being trapped in these very low productivity, low paying jobs. And I think to break the cycle, social protection is going to be very critical moving forward beyond the traditional investments in skills and a package and suite of services and broader sectoral and macro reform.
Absolutely. I mean, as a young person, just to that, I just have a couple of years of work experience now, and sort of shifting from one place to another
Yeah.
or to achieve something quote unquote better, social protection actually plays a very big role for me to be able to decide. Because again, person like me, I've displaced from my home state, and then I've moved to another city, and a lot of things seem like they sort of pull you back to to, I mean, I want to do something better, but then I don't think that that is a good risk to take.
Yeah.
So yes, makes sense completely. And I think that brings me to the end of all my questions that I had. You've answered. I mean, I had a particular question for, Shrayana, would you suggest some resources that people could look at? But I think you've mentioned a lot of them. And when we sort of release this to other people who are not there as audience over here, I'll definitely make sure that we do add those resources
Yes.
to them. And yes, I think that is it from my end. Thank you so much for joining us. And this has been an extremely amazing session with you. Thank you for accommodating all our last minute changes, and thanks a lot. I think yes.
No,
I'll
thank
be
you, Alicia. That's been such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for all your questions. And I wish you and everyone involved in the summit all the best for the future and your future deliberations.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody who has joined in.